In a freezing prison camp, Japanese mothers screamed in agony, not from war, but from childbirth. And in that moment, American doctors, sworn enemies just weeks before, made a choice that would defy hatred itself. In the chaos of World War II, mercy seemed like a forgotten word. But inside a guarded prison camp, an extraordinary act of compassion broke through the darkness. American doctors, surrounded by barbed wire and suspicion, risked punishment and even death to save the lives of Japanese mothers and their newborns. This is the story of how humanity triumphed over war. Amid the final months of the Pacific War, Japanese civilian women and nurses were captured and held in makeshift camps. Many were malnourished, sick, and pregnant. Every night, their cries blended with the sounds of distant gunfire. Hope was a luxury none could afford. Until one night, the gates opened, and American medics entered carrying medical kits instead of weapons. The night was thick with rain, and the air smelled of rust and fear. Inside the camp, the women huddled close together, wrapped in torn blankets, trying to protect their newborns from the cold that seeped through the bamboo walls. For months they had seen only cruelty, guards who shouted instead of spoke, food that came in handfuls, and faces that looked away when suffering appeared. So when the unfamiliar sound of English voices cut through the storm, confusion rippled across the camp. They were expecting another inspection, another punishment, another cruel reminder of their captivity. But instead, they saw white armbands with red crosses, not rifles or bayonets. A group of young American doctors stepped through the mud, their boots sinking deep as they hurried toward the cries echoing from the infirmary hut. One of them, Lieutenant Samuel Harris, barely 27, looked at the faces before him and froze for a moment. The sight was unlike anything he had seen on the battlefield. Rows of exhausted women, bellies swollen, eyes filled with both terror and pleading. He knelt beside the first woman, a nurse named Aiko, who was trembling and drenched in sweat. She was in labor, and the baby was coming too soon. Harris exchanged a quick glance with his partner, Dr. Collins, and without another word, they began their work. Their hands moved instinctively, guided by something deeper than orders, by the pure human need to help. The guards at the edge of the barracks hesitated. Technically, no one had given permission for American medics to treat Japanese prisoners. But even they could not ignore the agony in the room. One guard, barely older than a boy, turned away and muttered, "Let them be." And for the first time in months, the camp fell silent except for the whisper of rain and the labored breathing of women giving life in a place built for death. Harris worked by the dim light of a flickering lantern. His gloves were torn, his tools rusted from sea air, but he did not stop. He spoke softly to Aiko, though she didn't understand his words. She only heard the tone, the calm, steady rhythm that said, "You're safe now." Hours passed like minutes, and then a sound pierced the silence, a newborn's first cry. The mothers gasped, some covering their mouths, some weeping openly. Harris gently lifted the baby, wrapped in a piece of his own uniform shirt, and handed him to Aiko. She clutched the child to her chest, whispering prayers of thanks to both God and fate. Around her, the other women smiled for the first time in months. Even the guards stood motionless, their eyes softening in disbelief. Dr. Collins wiped his brow and whispered to Harris, "We just delivered life to our enemy's hands." Harris shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "We delivered life. That's all." Over the next few days, the medics continued returning to the camp, defying orders and ration limits. They brought milk, water, and medicine that had been meant for their own soldiers. They tended to infected wounds, delivered premature infants, and comforted women who had lost everything but the will to keep their babies alive. At night, Harris would sit outside the barracks, staring at the stars that hid behind clouds of war. He thought about his own wife, Mary, who was expecting their first child back home in Iowa. Maybe that was why he couldn't turn away. Maybe in saving these mothers, he was holding on to a piece of his own humanity. One morning, an officer arrived, Major Stevens. He was furious when he found out what his medics had been doing. "You're aiding the enemy," he shouted. "Do you realize what this means for your record?" Harris stood firm. "Sir, these are women. They're not the enemy. They're human beings." The major's jaw tightened. He wanted to yell again, but when he looked inside the barracks and saw a baby sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, he said nothing. Instead, he turned away, muttering under his breath, "You'll answer for this, Lieutenant." Word spread beyond the camp walls. Some soldiers mocked the medics, calling them traitors in white coats. Others quietly admired them, understanding that in war, there are moments when morality is the bravest act of defiance. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between the medics and the prisoners deepened. The women began to trust them, offering small gestures of gratitude, a handmade cloth, a whispered arigato, a tearful smile. One elderly nurse named Hannah, whose son had died earlier in the war, told Harris through an interpreter, "When you help us, I see my son again. You give me reason to live." Those words stayed with him for the rest of his life. But mercy in wartime is never without consequence. The medics were eventually ordered to leave the camp. Their supplies were confiscated, and they were reassigned to another unit. Before they left, dozens of Japanese mothers lined up at the gates, holding their babies close, tears running down their faces. Some offered pieces of cloth as gifts. Others simply bowed deeply, unable to speak. Harris didn't need words. He understood. As the jeep drove away, he looked back one last time. The image of those women standing in the rain, waving goodbye with their newborns in their arms, was burned into his memory forever. After the war, Harris returned home. He never spoke of the incident publicly, but every year, on the anniversary of his son's birth, he would sit on the porch with a single candle lit in silence. His wife once asked him why. He simply said, "For the babies we saved that weren't ours." Decades later, a letter arrived from Japan. It was from a man named Kenji, a doctor. In perfect English, he wrote, "My mother told me that I was born in a prison camp, delivered by an American doctor who risked his life for her. I became a doctor to honor him. If this letter finds you, please know that your kindness lived on." Harris never replied. His health was failing by then, but he asked his son to place the letter in his coat pocket when he was buried. It was found there years later, folded neatly beside his old medic badge. History rarely remembers small acts of compassion, especially in times of war. But for those who were touched by them, they never fade. Somewhere in Japan, children who should never have survived the darkness of that time grew up to raise families of their own. All because a few young men with white armbands chose humanity over hatred. And though nations healed and decades passed, one truth remained unshaken: that even when surrounded by walls of barbed wire and orders of vengeance, mercy can still break through. And the simplest act, a doctor saving a life, can echo louder than any victory trumpet ever blown. The doctors had been ordered to stay away from the enemy. But when they heard the screams of women in labor, their duty as humans outweighed their orders as soldiers. One medic, Lieutenant Harris, whispered to his commander, "Sir, we swore an oath to save life, not to judge it." And with that, they stepped into the unknown, knowing that mercy might cost them their careers or their lives. The rain was falling hard that night, beating against the metal roofs of the prison huts, turning the muddy ground into rivers of filth. The sound of suffering was unmistakable, a cry not of pain from a wound or injury, but of childbirth, raw and desperate. Every instinct told them to turn away, to obey the command to maintain distance from the prisoners. Yet something deeper, something unspoken within their hearts, refused to let them walk away. Harris tightened his grip on his medical kit, and looked at his men. They exchanged a silent nod, the kind of understanding that needs no words. As they entered the dimly lit barrack, the smell of sickness and sweat filled the air. The flicker of a single lantern revealed a young Japanese woman lying on a wooden cot, clutching her swollen belly. Her face was pale, her lips trembling from exhaustion and fear. Around her, other women watched in silence, too afraid to speak, too weak to move. When the Americans stepped inside, the women flinched, expecting punishment, not help. Harris knelt beside her, murmuring softly, his voice calm and reassuring, even though she could not understand the words. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're going to be all right." He reached for his tools, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. These were his enemies, the people he had been trained to see as the reason for his comrades' deaths. Yet as he looked into the woman's terrified eyes, he saw not an enemy, but a mother. And that changed everything. The other medics followed his lead, setting up whatever makeshift supplies they had. A torn blanket, a canteen of water, a small piece of morphine saved for emergencies. The guards hesitated, unsure if they should intervene. One sergeant barked, "This isn't your concern, Lieutenant." But Harris didn't even look up. "Then make it my crime," he replied quietly, continuing his work. The woman screamed again, her body convulsing with pain. Harris instructed one of his men to hold her hand, while he did what he could with the little equipment available. Every second felt eternal. Sweat ran down his forehead as he muttered prayers under his breath. Prayers that she and the baby would live. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the camp in short bursts of white. It felt as if heaven itself was bearing witness to this forbidden act of compassion. After what seemed like hours, the baby arrived, small, fragile, and silent. For a terrifying moment, no one breathed. Harris quickly cleared the child's airway, rubbed its chest, and prayed harder than he ever had on any battlefield. Then a cry, a soft, piercing cry that cut through the storm like music. The women gasped, and tears streamed down faces that had forgotten how to hope. Even the guards lowered their weapons, stunned by the sound of life emerging in a place meant for despair. Harris handed the newborn to the mother, who clutched the child close, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked at Harris with eyes full of gratitude and disbelief, whispering something in Japanese. Words he didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. She was thanking him, blessing him, forgiving him. That moment broke something inside him. The invisible wall that war had built between us and them shattered. He realized how fragile hate truly was when confronted with the miracle of life. The other medics worked quickly, cleaning up, comforting the other mothers, making sure the baby was warm and breathing steadily. They had crossed a line that night, a line drawn by politics, by orders, by fear, and none of them cared anymore. For that night, they were not Americans and Japanese. They were human beings, bound by something far greater than war. The next morning, word spread through the camp like wildfire. "The enemy doctors saved a baby," the women whispered. "They risked their lives for us." It was as if a light had been lit in the heart of darkness. Soldiers began to look differently at the prisoners. Even some guards softened, sneaking extra rations of rice to the women and their children. The change was subtle, but it was there. A reminder that compassion, once unleashed, can ripple through even the coldest souls. But mercy has its price. A few days later, the commanding officer called Harris into his tent. The tone was cold, the atmosphere tense. "You disobeyed a direct order," the officer said, his eyes sharp. "You treated the enemy without clearance. Do you understand the consequences?" Harris stood at attention but did not flinch. "Yes, sir," he said. "But I also understand that a child is alive today because of it." The officer's face remained stone-hard for a moment, then softened ever so slightly. He sighed and turned away. "You'll write a report," he said quietly, "and make sure it doesn't leave this camp." Harris saluted, then walked out. the echo of the baby's cry still ringing in his mind. That sound, he thought, was worth any punishment. Over the following weeks, Harris continued to help secretly whenever he could. Each new birth felt like a quiet act of rebellion against the cruelty of war. He began leaving small notes with Japanese phrases he had learned, words like peace, hope, and life. The women would smile when they saw them, folding the notes carefully as if they were treasures. Months later, when the war finally ended, Harris was among those assigned to oversee the release of the prisoners. As the women prepared to leave, many of them approached him, bowing deeply, their children clinging to their sides. One woman handed him a small cloth bundle. Inside was a wooden carving of a dove. Rough, uneven, clearly handmade. But it carried more meaning than any medal he had ever received. She said one word, slowly and clearly. Arigato. He bowed in return, his eyes misting as he whispered, Sayonara. Years passed, and Harris returned to a quiet life in America. He rarely spoke of the war, but on certain nights he would take out the small wooden dove and place it on his desk, staring at it in silence. To others, it was just a trinket. But to him, it was a reminder of the night he chose humanity over hatred, the night he remembered what it truly meant to be a doctor. When he grew old, his daughter once asked him, Dad, were you ever afraid in the war? He smiled faintly and said, Yes, but not of dying. I was afraid of forgetting what it means to be human. And in that single sentence lay the essence of his life, that in a world built on division, the greatest courage is kindness, and the truest victory is compassion. Inside the dim camp barracks, American hands worked feverishly under lantern light. The mothers were terrified, whispering prayers in Japanese, unsure if this was a trap. But when the first baby cried, silence fell, followed by tears. American and Japanese soldiers stood side by side, witnessing something the war had nearly destroyed, the sound of new life. In that moment, there were no nations, only people. The flickering flame of the lantern painted long shadows on the cracked wooden walls. Every movement was deliberate, every breath tense. The air smelled of iron, sweat, and earth. The room, usually filled with despair and the stench of illness, now carried something sacred, the fragile heartbeat of life pushing against the weight of war. Lieutenant Harris leaned back on his knees, his hands trembling as he stared at the newborn in his arms. The tiny chest rose and fell, proof that despite everything, starvation, cruelty, hopelessness, something pure had survived. The Japanese mother, pale and trembling, reached out her arms. Harris gently placed the child against her chest. She sobbed, clutching the baby as if the world around her no longer existed. Her whisper of arigato was barely audible, but it struck Harris deeper than any medal or praise ever could. Around him, the other medics stood still, exhausted, speechless. Even the guards who had come to observe, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, couldn't hide their awe. One of them, a young private barely old enough to shave, wiped his eyes before turning away, pretending the lantern smoke had stung them. For a fleeting moment, the war outside the fences did not exist. There was no hate, no propaganda, no orders, only the universal truth that life, no matter whose it is, deserves to be protected. Harris felt it in his bones. This was what it meant to be human. Another cry soon followed. A second woman was in labor. The medics rushed to her side without hesitation. They had no proper equipment, only determination and compassion. The prisoners moved instinctively to help, bringing water in tin cups, tearing pieces of their own tattered clothes to use as towels. The line between captive and liberator blurred completely. Harris could hear snippets of broken English, soft Japanese phrases, and the occasional command shouted by his men, all weaving together in a symphony of courage. Hours passed. Sweat poured down faces. The lantern burned low, And then, again, the miraculous sound of a newborn's cry filled the night. This time, no one could hold back their emotions. Soldiers and prisoners alike clapped, cheered, wept. The women kissed the hands of the Americans, their gratitude radiating in their trembling smiles. Dr. Collins, his uniform stained with mud and blood, turned to Harris and said softly, "For once, we're not fighting to destroy, we're fighting to save." Harris nodded, unable to speak. He felt tears burning in his eyes, and he let them fall. These were not tears of sorrow or exhaustion, but of awakening. The realization that even in a world ripped apart by hatred, kindness could still breathe. Outside, the storm that had raged for hours began to fade. The wind softened. The rain slowed to a drizzle, tapping gently on the metal roofs like a lullaby for the newborns. The guards lowered their weapons completely now. One of them, Sergeant Miller, an older man who had lost his brother in the Pacific, approached quietly. "Lieutenant," he said gruffly, "I didn't think I'd ever see the day I'd care if they lived or died. But tonight," his voice broke. He didn't finish the sentence. Harris put a hand on his shoulder and said, "War makes us forget who we are. Maybe this is how we remember." The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the holes in the barracks roof. The mothers slept, their babies bundled beside them. The camp, usually haunted by cries of pain, was silent except for the soft cooing of infants. It felt unreal. Harris stepped outside and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. For the first time in months, it didn't smell of gunpowder or rot. It smelled of hope. He looked at his men, their uniforms dirty, eyes red from lack of sleep, and saw pride there. Not the pride of soldiers, but of healers. They had done something beautiful in a place meant for ugliness. But beauty, in wartime, is fragile. Later that day, an officer arrived. Major Stevens, his uniform pressed, his voice sharp. He had heard rumors of what happened. His face was a mask of authority as he called Harris and his men to attention. "You disobeyed direct orders," he said coldly. "You entered the prisoner compound without clearance. You aided the enemy." Harris didn't look away. "Sir," he said quietly, "we aided mothers." The major's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered, just for a moment, betraying the humanity buried beneath his discipline. "This is not your duty, Lieutenant," he said. Harris took a slow breath. "With respect, sir, it's exactly my duty. We swore an oath, not to a nation, but to life itself." The major turned away, saying nothing more. Later, as he walked through the camp, he stopped outside the barracks. He looked in, saw the sleeping women, the tiny hands clutching pieces of cloth, the faint sound of babies breathing softly. His face softened. He didn't order punishment. Instead, he left quietly, as if understanding that some actions don't need approval to be right. In the days that followed, the prisoners began to see the Americans differently. They still feared them, yes, but beneath that fear grew something unexpected. Respect, even affection. The mothers would wave when they saw the medics pass. One woman, the first to give birth, began leaving small paper cranes near the fence each morning, a silent offering of thanks. Harris found one of them tucked into his pocket one evening, likely slipped there by one of the women. On its wing, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words in broken English. "You save hope." He stared at it for a long time, his throat tightening. That simple message carried more meaning than any medal or letter of commendation ever could. As weeks turned into months, the war drew to an end. The camp would soon be disbanded, the prisoners released. But long after the fences were torn down, the memory of that night remained in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. For the Japanese mothers, it was the night the enemy became their saviors. For the American soldiers, it was the night they rediscovered their souls. Years later, Harris would look back on that moment and realize that in saving those children, he had saved himself. He had stepped into the barracks as a soldier burdened by war, but he had walked out a man who remembered what mercy truly meant. In that flicker of lantern light, amid the cries and the rain and the trembling hands, humanity had triumphed, quietly, defiantly, beautifully. And though the world moved on, forgetting battles and dates, that sound, that tiny, miraculous cry, still echoed across time, reminding all who heard it that even in the darkest corners of war, compassion can still find its voice. Word spread across the camp. The enemy doctors saved our children. Soldiers who had once seen each other through rifles now saw each other through tears. One American medic gave up his rations to feed a newborn. Another carved a wooden cross for the mothers who had lost theirs. These were small gestures, but in the ruins of war, they were the seeds of peace. In a place where hatred had been planted and watered for years, something fragile and unexpected began to grow. The prisoners who had once looked at the guards with fear now nodded to them quietly in passing. The Americans, hardened by months of fighting and loss, began to soften when they heard a baby's cry echo from the infirmary. It was a sound that reminded them of home, of the world they had left behind, of wives and sisters and children they hadn't seen in years. The camp, once a place of punishment and pain, was slowly transforming, not through orders or treaties, but through compassion. Lieutenant Harris noticed it first. The tension in the air was different now. Guards no longer barked every command. Prisoners no longer cowered with the same terror. Every morning, when he walked through the camp with his kit in hand, the mothers would bow their heads slightly, whispering arigato as he passed. He didn't speak their language, but he understood the message. Gratitude had no need for translation. One morning, as he made his rounds, he noticed a tiny bundle placed near the gate. A carefully wrapped piece of cloth containing a few flowers and a small origami crane. It was a gift, one that the women had made using scraps of paper from ration packaging. Attached was a message written in broken English. "You give life. We never forget." Harris stood there for a long time, staring at the note as his throat tightened. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his journal, a private reminder that even in the ashes of destruction, beauty could still be born. Every act of kindness seemed to ripple through the camp like waves in still water. The medics had started sharing their limited supplies, bits of soap, warm cloth, and medicine, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. One medic, Private Ellis, had been known for his cynicism. He had lost his brother on the front lines and carried a deep resentment toward the Japanese. But after helping deliver a baby and seeing the frail mother whisper, "Thank you," through her tears, something in him broke open. From that day forward, Ellis visited the nursery hut every evening. He would bring his own bread and gently feed the infants, smiling quietly as their tiny hands reached up toward him. "They're just kids," he once muttered to Harris. "They didn't start this war." "None of them did." Harris only nodded. Some lessons didn't need to be spoken aloud. Not all of the soldiers understood. Some mocked the medics behind their backs, calling them bleeding hearts. Others warned that the kindness they showed could backfire. But even among the skeptics, something began to shift. When they saw how the prisoners looked at Harris's team with eyes full of trust instead of hatred, it stirred something inside them. They began to realize that the line between enemy and human was far thinner than they had been told. The camp's atmosphere slowly changed. It was no longer just a cage for the defeated. It was becoming a fragile sanctuary of redemption. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, a Japanese nurse named Hana approached Harris. Through an interpreter, she said, "When the war started, we were told Americans had no hearts. But you gave yours to our children." Harris didn't know what to say. He simply smiled and replied softly, "War doesn't take our hearts. We just forget where they are." She bowed deeply, tears welling in her eyes, and pressed her hands together in gratitude. It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of forgiveness between two nations still locked in conflict. As days passed, the small miracles continued. A young soldier who had lost faith in God found himself carving small wooden crosses for the mothers who prayed each night. He didn't share their language or religion, but he saw the comfort it gave them. Another soldier who had once bragged about hating the enemy began playing harmonica near the infirmary, softly at first, then louder as laughter began to echo from inside. The women smiled, the babies gurgled, and for a few fleeting minutes, war felt like a distant nightmare. These moments didn't erase the horrors that had happened, but they reminded everyone that humanity was still alive beneath the uniform and the fear. One of the babies, a frail boy born during a stormy night, became a symbol of hope throughout the camp. He had been named Haru, meaning spring. Whenever he laughed, people said it was as if winter had finally ended. Harris visited him often, sometimes holding him while staring out at the distant hills. "You'll never remember this place," he whispered once, "and I hope you never have to." But peace was still a fragile dream. Orders from higher command remained strict, and the medics knew they were risking severe punishment for their disobedience. Yet none of them stopped. Each act of kindness felt like defiance, not against authority, but against cruelty itself. They had seen too much suffering to turn their backs now. Harris often wondered if these moments of compassion would matter once the war ended. Would anyone remember that in a place surrounded by barbed wire and hate, mercy had taken root? He wasn't sure, but he kept going, because the alternative, indifference, felt unbearable. As the war drew to its final days, the air grew tense again. Rumors of surrender spread like wildfire. Some soldiers feared retribution, others longed for home. But inside the camp, the mothers continued to rock their babies, humming lullabies that mixed with the distant sound of artillery. The medics stayed until the very last moment, ensuring every child was safe, every wound tended, every small miracle preserved. When the end finally came, and the camp was ordered to release its prisoners, there was no celebration, only tears. The women lined up, each holding their child close, each bowing deeply to the Americans who had become their protectors. Harris stood among them, his uniform torn and stained, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. One by one, the mothers approached him, touching his hands, whispering blessings. One woman handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a hand-carved figure, a baby held by two open hands. "So you remember," she said through the interpreter. Harris couldn't speak. He just nodded, holding the carving tightly against his chest as they walked away. After the prisoners left, the camp felt unbearably quiet. The laughter of infants, once the heartbeat of the place, had vanished. The men moved slowly, lost in their thoughts. Harris stood by the empty barracks, staring at the wooden cross hanging above the doorway, the one his medic had carved weeks earlier. It swayed gently in the wind, a symbol of what they had built together, something fragile, fleeting, but eternal. Years later, when Harris returned home, he kept that small carving on his desk. Sometimes he would trace its edges, remembering the faces of the mothers, the sound of newborn cries, and the feeling of holding hope in his hands. He never received a medal for what he did, and he never expected one. His reward was knowing that in a world where humanity had nearly died, he had helped it live again. And somewhere, far across the ocean, in a small Japanese village, mothers told their children stories of the American doctors who came not with guns, but with mercy, and how in a time of hatred, they planted the first seeds of peace. When military authorities discovered what had happened, the doctors were reprimanded, accused of aiding the enemy. Yet, history forgot the punishment and remembered the act. Years later, one of the Japanese mothers named her son after the American doctor who delivered him. That child grew up to become a physician himself, dedicating his life to saving others, regardless of nationality. It's strange how history works, how the cruelty of war can bury compassion in silence for decades. And yet, a single act of mercy can echo through generations. The reprimand the American doctors faced was harsh. Their superiors viewed kindness as weakness, compassion as disobedience. In the eyes of command, their duty had been to serve their own, not to comfort the enemy. The men stood at attention as the orders were read aloud. Formal reprimands, threats of court-martial, their records stained. But none of that mattered to them. Deep down, they knew they had done the right thing. For once, they had chosen humanity over hatred, and that choice, though condemned by their superiors, would outlast the war itself. In the months that followed, the memory of those deliveries lingered in the camp like a ghost of something sacred. Soldiers whispered about it when the officers weren't around. Some called it foolish, others called it brave. But for the doctors who had held those newborns, who had watched life flicker into a world of death, it was something more profound, a moment of redemption. Each man carried that moment differently. Some wrote about it in secret journals, others never spoke of it again, afraid it would be twisted into something shameful. But all of them carried it, quietly, for the rest of their lives. For the Japanese mothers, it became a story of survival, a story whispered to their children as they grew, of strangers who risked everything to bring them into the world. Among them was one woman named Yuki, who had lost her husband in the early days of the war. Her son had been born during that desperate night when American medics worked under lantern light, their hands trembling but steady. She remembered how one doctor had stayed beside her for hours, speaking softly even though she couldn't understand his words. His voice, calm and patient, had been the first sound she heard after the pain. When her baby cried for the first time, the doctor had smiled, exhausted, and whispered something she never forgot. "He's going to live." To her, those words were a miracle. When the war finally ended and Yuki returned home to Japan, she named her child Daniel after that American doctor. It was a name that puzzled her neighbors and relatives, but she refused to change it. "It belongs to the man who gave my son life," she would say. As Daniel grew older, she told him the story again and again, about how, in the darkest moment of her life, someone from the other side of the war had shown her mercy. She told him about the man's calm eyes, his gentle hands, and how he had defied his own army's rules to help her. "Never hate," she told her son. "Kindness is stronger than any nation." Those words shaped Daniel's destiny. As he grew, he studied medicine, driven not by ambition, but by gratitude. In every patient he treated, he saw a reflection of that nameless mercy that had once saved him. His professors noted his calm under pressure, his refusal to judge anyone by their background. During the 1960s, when tensions between nations were still thick, Daniel volunteered for humanitarian missions abroad. In one of his letters home, he wrote to his mother, "I owe my life to an American. I can only repay that debt by saving others, no matter who they are." Meanwhile, the American doctor, Captain Daniel Harris, had long since returned home. He lived a quiet life, never speaking publicly about what happened. To him, it wasn't a story of heroism, but of necessity. He had simply done what was right, even when the world said it was wrong. Years later, when an old military record surfaced mentioning the incident, unauthorized medical aid to enemy prisoners, a journalist tracked him down. Harris, then in his 70s, listened quietly as the reporter asked him if he regretted what he'd done. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I didn't save enemies. I saved mothers and children. The war ended, but they're still here. That's what matters." The story was published in a small column, almost forgotten among the headlines of the day. But across the ocean, a young Japanese doctor came across that article and stopped breathing for a moment when he saw the name Captain Daniel Harris. He wrote a letter immediately, in careful English, explaining who he was. The child born under the care of American doctors during the war, named after one of them. He thanked Harris for his compassion, for his defiance, for his humanity. Weeks later, the reply came, shaky and written in the hand of an old man. "I remember your mother," it said. "She was brave. You were very small, and I didn't think you'd make it. I'm glad I was wrong." The two corresponded for years, their letters becoming a bridge between former enemies, now bound by something far greater than politics: gratitude. When Harris passed away, Daniel flew across the Pacific to attend his memorial. He stood among strangers in a small churchyard in Ohio, holding a single white lily. When it was his turn to speak, he said softly, "I am the life you saved." The room fell silent. Some wept quietly. Others simply bowed their heads. In that moment, the weight of history seemed to lift, if only slightly. 2 generations connected by one act of mercy that had defied the rules of war. Afterward, Daniel returned to Japan and continued his work as a doctor, dedicating himself to healing victims of natural disasters and refugees displaced by conflict. Whenever he was asked why he chose such a difficult path, he would tell the same story, about an American soldier who was punished for kindness, and how that kindness gave him his life. "The world doesn't remember the reprimand," he would say, smiling. "It remembers the compassion." In the end, that was how history chose to remember it, not through official reports or military commendations, but through the quiet continuity of human goodness. No monument was ever built for those American medics, no medal pinned to their uniforms, but their legacy lived on in every life they touched. The punishment they received was temporary. The mercy they gave was eternal. Sometimes, when Daniel visited his patients, he carried a small locket around his neck. Inside it was a faded photograph, his mother holding him as an infant, standing beside a man in uniform. The edges were worn, the colors nearly gone, but the meaning never faded. It was a reminder that compassion, once given, never dies. It crosses oceans, transcends generations, and weaves strangers into family. And somewhere, beyond the reach of history's judgments and wars, that American doctor's act of defiance still echoed, not as disobedience, but as proof that in the darkest times, one human heart can change the course of another forever. This story isn't just about war. It's about the moment we choose kindness over obedience, compassion over pride. These American doctors didn't just save lives. They reminded the world that even in the darkest of times, light can still break through. Because real victory is not won on the battlefield. It's won in the heart. The echoes of that truth ripple far beyond the dusty pages of history books. It is the quiet defiance of those who choose humanity over hate that reshapes the soul of nations. Those doctors may not have known it then, but their simple decision to heal instead of harm became a silent revolution, one that spoke louder than any general's speech or any flag raised in triumph. Their courage was not about bullets or bravery. It was about love in a place where love had no business surviving. In that war-torn world, mercy was more dangerous than violence. The order was clear. The enemy was to be feared, not helped. Despised, not comforted. But these men looked past the uniforms, past the language barriers, past the bitterness that centuries of propaganda had built. They saw mothers, they saw children, they saw the raw and trembling pulse of life struggling to continue in a place that had forgotten how to hope. And when they chose to reach out their hands instead of tightening their fists, they did something greater than winning a battle. They restored faith in what it means to be human. Imagine the stillness of that camp after it all ended. The barbed wire still stood. The watchtowers still loomed. But something invisible had shifted. The air felt lighter. The guards, who had been taught to see their captives as subhuman, had watched with their own eyes as American medics held newborn Japanese babies as if they were their own. No translation was needed. The message was universal. It said, "We are the same. We bleed the same. We love the same. And that message spread quietly through every heart that witnessed it. It was more powerful than any weapon, because it planted something deeper. A question. If compassion can exist here, in this hell, then maybe peace is still possible. The true measure of humanity is not how we treat our allies, but how we treat our enemies. The doctors had no guarantee of safety, no assurance of forgiveness from their commanders. They acted on instinct, an instinct written not in orders or manuals, but in the soul. Their defiance wasn't loud. It didn't make headlines. It was silent, humble, and pure. And yet, years later, when people remembered that war, when they recalled the destruction and pain, they also remembered this, that somewhere behind the front lines, compassion had survived, that not all hearts had turned to stone, that even in war, goodness refused to die. Acts like these remind us that history is not just made by kings, generals, or treaties. It's shaped by ordinary people who choose to do what's right when no one is watching. These doctors didn't fight for medals or glory. They weren't following orders or seeking redemption. They acted because their conscience demanded it. And that is what makes their story timeless. It speaks to every generation that faces division, every soul that's torn between anger and empathy. It whispers that real strength lies not in domination, but in understanding. Not in revenge, but in forgiveness. When we think of victory, we often picture conquest, a flag raised, an anthem played. But these men taught the world a different kind of triumph. Theirs was a victory of the spirit, not of the sword. It was the victory of a heart that refused to be hardened, of a conscience that refused to go silent. And maybe that's what the world needs to remember most. That no nation, no ideology, no war can erase the fundamental truth that we are bound together by our shared humanity. For the mothers whose lives were saved, the memory of that night never faded. They carried it in their hearts, told their children about it, and those children told theirs. Generations later, that single act of mercy still lived. Not in history books, but in family stories, in bedtime tales of strangers who showed love when the world had turned to hate. And that's the power of compassion. It doesn't end where the act ends. It continues, multiplying quietly through time, shaping lives we will never see. When the doctors looked back years later, they didn't think of themselves as heroes. Some barely spoke of what they had done. But perhaps that's the most powerful part of it all, that kindness needs no recognition to change the world. It doesn't ask for applause. It simply exists, doing what's right, even when the world calls it foolish. The war had tried to divide, to label, to destroy. But in that one night, compassion reminded everyone that humanity cannot be divided. No wall, no barbed wire, no ideology can silence the heart's capacity to love. There's a moment in every human life where obedience and morality collide, where you must choose between what you're told to do and what you know is right. Those doctors stood in that moment and chose courage. They chose empathy, and that choice, quiet, dangerous, and unseen, carried more power than any weapon ever could. It's easy to follow orders. It's harder to follow your conscience. But history has always belonged to those who had the courage to choose the latter. Today, their story serves as a mirror. It asks us, in our own lives, when do we choose kindness over pride? Do we only show compassion when it's convenient? Or do we dare to show it when it costs us something? The true heroes of this world are rarely the ones who shout the loudest. They are the ones who reach out a hand, even when the world tells them not to. They are the quiet rebels of goodness, the ones who light candles in storms. When those American doctors walked into that camp, they didn't just deliver babies. They delivered a message that still echoes today. That empathy is not weakness. That compassion is not surrender. That sometimes, to truly win, you must dare to care. Their story is a testament to the idea that humanity's greatest strength lies not in how fiercely we fight, but in how deeply we love. Because when the dust of war settles, medals rust, monuments crumble, and flags fade. But mercy endures. It lives in the hearts of those who were saved, in the hands of those who choose to heal, and in the stories that remind us what we are capable of when we let our humanity lead the way. The real victory is never in the destruction of others, but in the preservation of our compassion, even when everything around us demands we let it go. And so, long after the noise of battle faded and the world moved on, the legacy of those doctors remained. It wasn't carved in stone or written in records. It was written in lives, in the quiet continuation of hope, in every heartbeat that exists, because someone once chose mercy over madness. That is what victory truly means. Not power, not dominance, but the courage to be kind in a world that has forgotten how. Wars end, but the echoes of compassion never fade. One act of mercy can heal generations. And when enemies choose to be human, the world changes forever. The battles may cease, the guns may fall silent, and the soldiers may return home. But the memory of kindness outlives the scars of war. When hatred has burned itself out and the flags are folded away, what remains is the quiet power of the human heart, that unbreakable part of us that still believes in goodness, even after witnessing destruction. The American doctors who stepped into that camp did more than save lives. They preserved something sacred, the idea that empathy can exist even in places built for cruelty. And long after the war's final shot echoed through the world, their act became a whisper passed down through time, reminding us that mercy never truly dies. Decades after those events, the children born in that prison grew up with stories of their mother's tears and the gentle hands of men once called the enemy. They carried those stories across continents and generations, turning them into lessons for their own children. In classrooms, in hospitals, in quiet family gatherings, the tale was retold of soldiers who chose healing over hatred. And every time it was spoken, it reignited a small spark of hope in a world still wrestling with division. That's the magic of compassion. It multiplies. It ripples outward, finding new hearts to soften, new wounds to heal. It's easy to believe that wars define humanity. The headlines, the monuments, the dates in history books, they all mark the destruction. But the truth is deeper and quieter. Humanity is defined not by the wars we fight, but by the kindness we show when fighting would be easier. Compassion doesn't make noise. It doesn't seek attention. Yet it endures long after the gunfire fades. Every generation inherits the choices of the one before. And these doctors gave the world something far greater than victory. They gave it proof that decency can survive even in hell. History doesn't always celebrate compassion. It celebrates conquest, power, and strategy. But in the quiet corners of the past, hidden between the headlines, there live moments like this, when ordinary men chose to be extraordinary in their humanity. They had no armor for what they faced, no orders to guide them, no certainty that their actions would matter. Yet they acted, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy that transcends rank and nation. Their courage didn't end the war, but it healed a part of it. It showed that even in a world obsessed with domination, mercy still has a place, and that place is sacred. Generations later, people still search for meaning in war. They study battles, dates, and strategies. But the real lessons are hidden in stories like this one, moments where compassion quietly rewrote the rules of conflict. These doctors didn't win medals or parades. They won something much greater, the hearts of those who saw them as proof that not all humanity had been lost. Because when you strip away uniforms, languages, and borders, what's left are people, fragile, flawed, but capable of immense kindness. That truth connects us across time. and it's why their story still matters today. One act of mercy can heal generations, not because it erases the pain, but because it shows that pain doesn't have to define us. Those mothers, once prisoners, taught their children not to hate. Those children, once victims, grew into healers, teachers, and dreamers who believed that the world could be better. And perhaps that is the truest victory any war can offer, to turn suffering into compassion and fear into understanding. Every act of kindness plants a seed, and even if the soil is stained by conflict, that seed will grow. It will bloom in unexpected places, in hospitals, in homes, in the hearts of people who never knew where it began. When enemies choose to be human, everything changes. Borders lose their meaning, titles lose their weight, and suddenly, the world feels smaller. Not because of maps, but because of empathy. In that moment when an American medic held a Japanese baby, the war paused, not on paper, but in spirit. For a heartbeat, humanity reclaimed itself. That single heartbeat has echoed through decades, quietly reminding us that goodness is not bound by nation or race. It's a choice, and it's one we can make every day. Even in times of peace, when the battlefields are invisible, but the divisions remain. So yes, wars will always end. The soldiers will go home, the history will be written, and the world will move on. But the echoes of compassion never fade. They linger in the spaces between generations, in the stories we tell, the forgiveness we offer, the empathy we teach our children. The flags may symbolize victory, but it's the lives we lift that give meaning to it. Because in the end, flags are fabric. They flutter, they fade, but a lifted life, that is eternal. The real measure of a nation's greatness is not in how fiercely it fights, but in how deeply its people care. Those doctors may have stood alone in that camp, but in choosing compassion, they carried the weight of civilization itself. They proved that the truest victory doesn't come from crushing an enemy, but from reaching across the divide and saying, "I see your pain, and I will help you heal." That's the kind of victory that can't be recorded in statistics or celebrated in parades, because it belongs not to one side, but to all of humanity. So remember this: one act of mercy can ripple through time and outlast any empire. The compassion you show today may save a life tomorrow, may soften a heart you'll never meet, may mend a wound you'll never see. The American doctors never knew the full impact of what they did, but that doesn't diminish it. It magnifies it. Their courage wasn't loud, but it was lasting. Because in the end, it's not the flags we raise, but the lives we lift that define us. Those words are not just poetic. They are the truth of history. Flags will fall, nations will change, but the lives lifted through kindness will stand forever. And perhaps someday, when the world feels cold again, someone will remember this story and choose mercy once more.